Good morning, everyone. Good try. Good morning, everyone. Nice job. Appreciate that very much. Good morning. My name is George Sugai. I'm at the University of Connecticut, and I have the privilege, as one of the co-directors of the National Center, and I'm kind of a committee member for the conference or the forum, to be able to introduce our keynote this morning. It is a distinct and important privilege and honor to welcome and introduce Katherine Bradshaw. She is a PBIS colleague and a friend to all of us inside this room. You're probably wondering why this is an honor and privilege, in particular for me. It's one, in part, because she's been with us for the 20 years of our National Center. Also because she's been with us for the 15 years that this forum has been operating. And she's been an important influence on how the center operates as well as how the forum operates. Why do we call Katherine our friend? I'd like to give you 5 main reasons for why we invited her to be our honored guest on this particular anniversary, or the 20th year of our center. Reason number 1, she has been and is a PBIS senior mentor. She's been a lead trainer for much of our effort. She's a principal investigator of some very significant investigations around the kinds of things that you all do out there in the field. She has been a state and national policy shaper, very influential on much of the things that are happening at the federal government. And she's been an all-around PBIS promoter, not only at the highest levels at the national, but also at the local level as well. For reason number 2, why she's our friend and colleague in the PBIS kind of world. She's well positioned to conduct research, implement evidence-based practices and systems with the highest degree of fidelity, and lead us in this room to about what we should be doing. Just listen to these credentials. First of all, her PhD is in developmental psychology from Cornell University. Her master's degree is in counseling and guidance from the University of Georgia. Currently, she works at 2 universities. I only work at 1. She works at 2 universities. At Johns Hopkins in the Bloomberg Schools of Public Education and Public Health and Education. She leads research related to prevention sciences, violence prevention, mental health, public health, and early intervention. At the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, she is the Associate Dean of Research and Faculty Development at the Curry School of Education. Her primary responsibility in that position is to implement PBIS practices and systems with the adult faculty members in that particular institution. Reason number 3, she's a shaker and mover in powerful places. It's really important for you to know that she is a voice in these places. She hangs out in the National Academy of Sciences, the National Institute of Mental Health, the Society of Prevention Research, Society for Research and Child Development, the National Institutes of Health, Institutes of Education Science, Centers for Disease Control, the National Science Foundation, and at SAMHSA. Recently, she was noticed, I saw a Facebook posting, she was at the Dave Matthews concert for Charlottesville. So she gets around and she has pretty significant influence on PBIS. Reason number 4, she has done the research. If you look at her curriculum vitae, she has 179 peer-reviewed articles, and that's a pretty important number. She has top journal articles in psychology, education, public health, prevention sciences, and in PBS. She has systematically studied much of what we do inside this room. She has dealt with some of the most complex and most difficult education and social problems. Things like bullying behavior, obesity, cultural and racial inequity and disparity, violence and sexual victimization, staff burnout and retention, negative school climate, alcohol use and abuse, and antisocial behavior risk factors. To these complex problems, she has studied a wide range of intervention practices, including the good behavior game, classroom checkup, paths and PACs, check and check out, behavioral coaching, social skills instruction, and of course, the core elements of what we call the PBIS framework. She has taught me the importance of research and being able to defend the kinds of decisions we make in classrooms and schools. And she has taught me the important message that if you make a decision, are you willing to bet your next month's salary on that decision? And the importance of the research that's used to answer those questions. More importantly, I have a go-to list that I use to defend the kinds of decisions that I make in the work that I do. There are 25 peer-reviewed articles that are on my go-to list. Of those 25 articles, 21 of them have Katherine Bradshaw as the lead author or co-author of those studies. And you need to know that at least 6 of those 25 are randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard for documenting the work that we do in the PBIS world. And finally, reason number 5, Katherine exemplifies the fundamental tenets and core features of PBIS in her own professional and personal behaviors. Across places, people, and contexts, she engages in expected behaviors that are respectful, mentoring, responsible, patient, thoughtful, and self-regulating. And, of course, caring to all of us inside this room, as well as the children, youth, and families out in the field. So please join me with this distinct privilege and honor to welcome our colleague and friend, Katherine Bradshaw, to celebrate the 20th year of the PBIS Center and the 15th year of the PBIS Leadership Forum with an opening keynote.
So that's quite overwhelming to have someone who has mentored me in my research. In fact, the first big grant I submitted was called a Career Development Award, a K Award. And George was actually one of my mentors on that, so he helped me learn a lot about PBIS and how to do research on it. So I am thrilled to be here. It's really quite an honor. I think the first time I went to a forum presentation was when I first started at Johns Hopkins. And I was working with our team to, somehow this isn't pulling up. Brian, of course, you know, the IT thing. So when I first went to this conference on positive behavior support, we were at Naperville. And so I remember coming in and trying to figure out, like, what is this PBIS thing? Because I joined Johns Hopkins as a faculty member, and my colleague, Phil Leaf, and at the time, a woman named Susan Keyes had just launched this first randomized controlled trial of positive behavior support. And I was like, sure, I can come on board. And then about 4 days later, Susan Barrett and other team members, you know, I got to know them quite a bit. And then Susan Keyes said, I'm going to leave the university and go to SAMHSA and be the prevention branch chief. Can you take over essentially as the PI on this project with Phil? And I was a little overwhelmed being, you know, literally 4 or 5 days on the job, but it's been a great journey for me in terms of my career to be able to understand positive behavior support and both the potential as well as some of the challenges along the way. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about how I view the issue of school climate and positive behavior support potentially as a vehicle for promoting school climate. So I'm going to first define school climate. Hopefully you all are familiar, especially all these fabulous grantees here in the audience. Talk a little bit about issues related to measurement, why it's important, and what we can do to actually improve it. So when I think about climate, I tend to think about norms. And hopefully you're already starting to think, oh, PBIS, we're trying to promote positive norms for behavior and expectations within a school setting. So hopefully this is all going to connect up. Values. What kind of values do we promote within our school environment about achievement, expectations for students? Expectations, clearly. And these are the areas that we're really trying to help students as well as adults feel socially safe, emotionally safe, and physically safe. So really that's the core element of school climate. The U.S. Department of Ed put forth a model specifically related to school climate that really served as a foundation for some of the transformation grants, as well as some of the work that we've done within the state of Maryland around safe and supportive schools. And they defined 3 core areas of engagement, safety, and environment. And you can see really under engagement, it's about relationships, how people connect to teachers, connect to each other, connect to the idea of being a member of that school community. We can also think about engagement as another issue around academics. How academically engaged are they with the curriculum? Issues of culture and equity within schools are very critical to our understanding of engagement as our parents. And the list goes on. When we shift over thinking about safety, we think not only about do I feel safe, but what other kind of behaviors might actually compromise my safety within the school environment. And the environment is much more than just a built environment, but in fact, we are showing quite important findings related to how the built environment of schools. Physical things like trash in the hallway or lighting, those are signals to students that issues of safety are often compromised. So we need to be thinking about that. You also see that rule and consequence, that's an issue of environment. That's another area that we connect up with positive behavior support. George kind of made a joke a little bit about when I went to the University of Virginia and I kind of organized it around positive behavior support. Well, it's actually true. And I gave my job talk there and put up the data systems practices. I also gave a logic model of how I thought the school should run. And we actually just recently adopted this model of school climate for the University of Virginia. We went through the process of doing focus groups with students and faculty and alumni and parents about what does school climate look like in higher ed. And what was very interesting is to go through this. And so in fact, I would actually encourage you to think about what does climate look like in your school? That's what we've labeled the boxes based on our research and based on the work of the US Department of Ed. But this is actually an interesting and very important activity to be thinking about what's very salient in the school. Under issues of safety, dating violence came up at the university level as being very important. Issues of equity and engagement, particularly along the alumni base. Those were things that we don't think about in an elementary, middle, or high school setting, but are so critical in a higher ed. So you could think a little bit about climate and how you define it within your particular context as an activity. So you heard me say a little bit about some elements of behavior fitting in there. Some people talk about climate as just being perceptual, whether I perceive the environment to be equitable versus whether I have an equitable experience within that building. So when we start thinking about that connection between behavior and climate, I actually see it as being very cyclical. So take, for example, if you're being bullied within the school environment, that's probably going to influence the way that you perceive your safety and the behavior that you engage in, especially if there are other adults that you think aren't really intervening on your behalf and helping out. So the two of these are really very tightly coupled in my mind. And sometimes it's actually hard for us to tease them apart. So that's why on our model, we include things like bullying, both the behavior of did I get victimized, as well as does the environment condone bullying behavior? Are adults actually doing enough to intervene around this? So one thing to think a little bit about the behavior relative to perceptions. In my work, it seems that both are very important. And in fact, when we talk to school administrators, they're often very interested in the more behavioral data rather than just the perceptual data. For some reason, that's realer to them. I remember talking to the administrators when we were first launching this and getting feedback on the school climate data. And they kind of lumped all of that climate stuff as just being perceptual, and the real data were the administrative data, the office referrals, the suspensions. And I was like, well, isn't this real too? Because your behavior is real through your perceptions. If you perceive the environment to be unsafe, you're going to act that way. So these are very important elements. And it's great to see federal legislation actually promoting the issue of school climate. If you have been living under a rock or out of the country for a long period of time, you may not be aware, but we have reauthorized No Child Left Behind under a new name, ESSA. We heard a little bit about this before. And it's nice to give a little shout out to President Obama being here in Chicago. But there are elements of ESSA that are talking about issues of non-academic indicators. And I've met with a number of different states that are really going through this process of trying to figure out what are they going to do? What are some of these indicators that they're going to draw in? And how are those data going to be collected? And in fact, one thing that we've learned is quite often we ask children about their perceptions and staff perceptions and have anonymous surveys. But around ESSA, there's much more emphasis on being able to disaggregate by subgroups, like low socioeconomic students or students of color. And so these are issues of tension when we start thinking about wanting people to be honest with their data and linking that up with actual student identifiers. So there's a real interesting movement in the field about how we link up academic data with perceptual data and self-report data. So this is a really exciting movement, and it's great to see so many states working together and using frameworks like positive behavior support to implement activities under ESSA, and frankly, using some of the resources that are available for that to actually improve school climate. So let's shift over and talk a little bit about how you measure school climate. I mentioned that ESSA is often pushing issues around surveys. That tends to be the most common approach that's used. And we can think about students. I've talked a lot about students, but staff and teachers are critical members of the school environment as well. And I think you would probably want to know about their perceptions. And I'll tell you a little bit in a while why that's so important and what data we know about teacher perceptions. Administrators also have a particular view, as do parents. But there are other ways that we can learn about school climate and the school environment. Observations are one. Can we actually observe school climate? Can you send people into a classroom or to a school and actually rate the environment? We actually got a grant to test that question out. We sent in observers that lined up elements of classroom behavior and indicators of student success and safety that we could actually observe within a classroom, as well as a school-wide setting. So we were able to actually link up those data from multiple perspectives. And then you can also think a little bit about administrative data. Are there elements of suspension or academic performance or attendance that might tell you a little bit about order and discipline, as well as issues around student engagement? So I would encourage you, when you start thinking about measuring school climate within your environment, you think about multiple sources. And there are a number of resources that are out there for you. The U.S. Department of Education has put together a measure of school climate that's available free of charge, and you can go on and download their resource packet from the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environments. So that may be a potential resource. Many of those measures there, especially the U.S. Department of Ed measure, is a little bit more perceptual, whereas I had talked to you a little bit about also thinking other kind of behavioral indicators. So it might be helpful to think about multiple measures. So let's dig into some of the data that we've been collecting. So these are data from across the state of Maryland. We had a very large initiative that we were fortunate to partner with our colleagues at Shepherd Pratt Health System, as well as the Maryland State Department of Education, to get a federal grant from the U.S. Department of Ed that was called Safe and Supportive Schools. And this helped us develop a platform for assessing school climate across the state. And so I'm presenting here a little bit of data on those three dimensions of safety, engagement, and environment. And these are from 37,000 students across 114 schools, representing half of the districts in the state. And so what's interesting here, we've actually even expanded the survey to include elementary, middle, and high school students. And so one might look at this, see, 88% of the students are feeling safe in elementary schools. And, it changes just a little bit by high school. But that does suggest that there are a group of students that just aren't feeling safe within that environment. And they're disproportionately represented by students of color and students that have history of victimization in the school. And in fact, when you look at rates of bullying, 41% of the elementary school students say that they were bullied within the past month. When you drop down and look at alcohol use as a problem, I think many of our administrators were very surprised to see that 73% of the high school students were reporting that issues of alcohol were of concern. Then when we think about engagement, feeling of belonging, well, that's great that it's a little bit higher at elementary school, but what's happening at high school? Is it because of our buildings being larger, or some aspect of the student environment that's shifting that such that 69% of our students at the high school level are feeling that they belong? Very interesting to look at this from a developmental perspective. I also like thinking a bit about this environment piece. We tend to think that students are not always so sensitive to disruptions that might be happening in the classroom. We didn't ask this question of the younger students in elementary school, but to see 73% and 69% of our students are actually thinking that disruptions are getting in the way of their learning. So this is showing how important it is to adopt models like positive behavior support that can reduce those kinds of discipline problems and actually allow students to learn, because I think in many cases they actually want to learn, but some of these problems like bullying and disruptions are getting in the way of that process. Also, when you look about cleaned and well-maintained buildings, 53% of the high school students feel like their school is not clean. That sends a message of disrespect in many cases for these students. So those are interesting data for us to look at as adults, but we actually even shared some of this data with the students. In fact, the school climate effort within the schools was very much one of promoting youth voice. My colleague Patty Hirschfeld is going to do a session on Friday where she's talking a little bit about how data were shared around school climate with the high schoolers in this particular project as a way of engaging them in the youth change process, actually empowering them, like a youth development initiative, to use the data and engage around that. In fact, even just collecting the data gives them voice and power and equity within the school environment. And not only have we implemented these models using positive behavior support, using randomized designs to be able to test whether they're having a significant impact at the high school level, but also more recently at the middle school level. So how do we engage middle schoolers in this change process and give them voice and opportunities to be part of the process? And in fact, we see multiple perspectives on this issue of climate. How is the best way for us to really leverage that and use that information? In fact, many of our district partners are very eager to collect information from the parents about school climate. And I'll share this. This is actually a flyer that the district put together that has launched a very extensive effort to collect data on school climate from their parents. And no, that's not a typo. 8.3% of parents from this school participated in the survey. That's an indicator of parent engagement if I ever saw one. And so they actually put this together, showing some of the items that were on the survey and trying to get parents to have their own voice and their own engagement in this process. So it's interesting to think about the collection of data is actually an engagement activity and a signal of that. Let's think about another way that we can conceptualize different perspectives on the environment. One of the areas I spend a lot of my time thinking about is around bullying and how we can do a better job detecting bullying and intervening more effectively in school environments. But we've shown study after study that adults, although conceptually agree that bullying is a bad behavior and that it's a problem and it causes a disruption, they rarely actually say that they see it happening within the classroom. And in fact, the vast majority of bullying happens in the classroom because kids spend more time there than anywhere else. But teachers are doing a lot, and so it's hard for them to be able to detect the social network that's emerging and the relational aggression that's happening in any one given moment. In fact, we're doing a study now where we're using simulators, bringing teachers into a simulated classroom environment called Teach Live, and helping them learn to detect bullying while they're teaching a lesson and how to actually intervene with it. And we have a coach there that gives them feedback around that process. So that way, they can learn to detect it more effectively, because if you can't see something, it's really hard for you to change your own behavior in response to it. So this is a perceptual problem as well as a response problem. And in fact, this is one reason why kids don't tell adults about it, because they feel like it's going to only be another thing that they have to worry about and that the adults can't really do anything to change what's happening. So in fact, most of the research shows only about 20% of students actually report bullying incidents to adults. But we use our school climate data to really unpack this and better understand it. So these are data from about 15,000 students. I mean, these are pretty big samples. This isn't like 5 kids we pulled across in the hallway. These are really large samples of kids to try to understand complex phenomena. 43% of the students said that they had seen adults at the school watching bullying and doing nothing. 58% thought that the school was not doing enough to prevent bullying. And 61% actually thought that the teachers made situations worse when they intervened. This is very disheartening and makes me very sad to look at these results. When I asked the staff, 1,400 of them, 1,500 actually, 97% said they would intervene if they saw bullying. Are you detecting any kind of pattern and discrepancy here? 87% thought they had effective strategies. And a mere 7% believed that they made the situation worse when they intervened. I'm not trying to finger point. I come from a family of teachers. I work in a school of education. I recognize the challenges associated with this, but we got a clear problem here in terms of our disconnect. And you think about being that kid sitting in a classroom where you're being bullied and you think that the teacher doesn't care and doesn't intervene. By not responding, you're condoning that behavior. And so this is a challenge. And what are some of the reasons for that? Well, I have a colleague in Nebraska named Sue Swear, who's really like the bullying guru in this area. She's done a lot of really important work in this area and developed some intervention models. And this is one of her slides she lets me borrow. And it really is a task that a kid did. This is actually a real drawing. And you can see on the left-hand side is the angel with the halo, and it says, this is a bully when adults are around. But then you have the kid with the horns on the right-hand side, bully when adults aren't around. In fact, adults sometimes are so focused on the popular kids, not realizing that they're often the ones at the higher elements of the social hierarchy that are inflicting a lot of this damage and victimization to their peers. So again, something very important for us to think about. And let's kind of think a little bit more about the school environment and how we can signal issues of safety. There's a theory called social disorganization theory, which frankly comes out of some of the community work that started right here in Chicago. There are a lot of sociologists and criminologists that did a very important work here in the Chicago area. And we've been taking that and trying to apply it to schools. Are there indicators of disorder within the school environment that might signal that it's unsafe or that adults don't care about things like bullying? So we've actually developed an administrator walkthrough tool that gives them information about the school environment. One of my colleagues, Sarah Lindstrom Johnson, just got a partnership formed with a bunch of computer scientists to turn this thing into an app, so that way principals can walk around their school actually knowing what to look at. So we'll be excited to do a little bit more testing of that app as we develop it over this year and hopefully make it available to you all. But that's one tool that we think that administrators might find helpful to be able to understand some indicators of the school environment. And why do we care so much about school climate? Well, we know that school climate is associated with fewer discipline problems, suspensions, aggression, the list goes on and on. And this is a core reason why many of our interventions are intended to promote school climate as a way of actually impacting outcomes for students. But it's also associated with good things too, like academic motivation and engagement, achievement, as well as psychological constructs like well-being. Very important for us to know. I steal this kind of red star idea from a George and Rob kind of phenomena. I really want to point out that we know that there are inequities in our perception of the school environment. Particularly students of color tend to report less supportive relationships with teachers, they have lower perceptions of equity, and they perceive the environment less safe. So this really draws our attention to think about, we don't want to just be looking at one big number, we want to actually look even at some variation for subgroups. So the systems that we've developed actually have all the school climate data go in online, and then schools can use an online platform to disaggregate their data, much like you do with SWIS. So that way you can pull out a subgroup and understand what is their experience or their perception. So something important for us to think about as we start collecting more data in this area. And teachers are very important too. In fact, school climate impacts them as well. Issues around discipline in the classroom lead to less instructional time, teachers suspending students and sending them out of class. It also decreases motivation and distracts them. Many teachers didn't come into the field to deal with classroom management issues. They probably came in to be instructional leaders and to help kids, and often end up managing a lot of problems. That's why proactive strategies like positive behavior are so important. But issues burnout get in the way. I can't tell you how sad it is when we come back meeting with our coaches on occasion and they say, you know, I was in this classroom and these teachers are just so burned out. Some of them are crying and sad at the end of the day that they feel that they don't have the tools to be able to manage some of the challenges that they're faced. Some of that starts early in terms of our pre-service. What are we doing to actually give teachers those skills before they go into the field? But also we know we need more in-service support, and not just broad professional development, but coaching to be able to support teachers. And in fact, there's some really interesting work coming out around mindfulness. I have a colleague named Tish Jennings who's developed a model for mindfulness for adults to actually help them become more aware of their own stress and their own emotions and how that's impacting them. But there are other issues around the role administrators can play. In fact, we know when educators feel supported by their leadership in the school, they report higher levels of communication and better collegiality. They also have better academic outcomes when they report experiencing open communication within the environment as compared to more of like a secretive or unilateral kind of process for making decisions. They also need to feel the support of their colleagues. And these are all things that school-wide positive behavior support is supposed to do. Create more consistency, more communication, more agreement and support for implementing processes and practices school-wide. So that way you don't have that one teacher who's kind of going against the grain in this area. And school climate issues also impact retention. We know that issues of teacher turnover are concentrated, particularly in our urban areas. Some of our schools, particularly in urban areas like Baltimore, have a really tough time even getting substitute teachers to come into the school because people are afraid of the school environment or don't actually want to really engage in that particular setting. So we need to be thinking about teachers' own psychological experiences and what impact they have. And this really goes back to that behavior and climate dynamic that happens, that the teacher's own behavior impacts the climate for students as well. So how many of you took Psych 101? All right. Anybody remember this Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Well, you know, when I look back over this thing, it's kind of like school climate. If you think about it, you have the psychological needs and the physiological needs, issues around safety. I didn't actually modify these titles here. This is a real hierarchy of needs. But when you think about it, these are base foundational experiences that any human needs in order to be self-actualized. Well, you could actually take the self-actualization and put on there improved academic performance, high school completion. These really are very foundational to our needs as individuals and aren't just some artifact or some soft fuzzy type of thing that we think, oh, those liberals really want to do this. These are core foundations that we know as psychologists and human development researchers that we need to be promoting in all individuals, not just our students, but providing that. And in fact, this is really important when we start thinking about stress, because teaching is stressful and schools can be stressful. And there are a variety of different settings that can be stressful. What I perceive as stressful might be a little bit different than what you perceive. So let's kind of unpack stress a little bit more and think about why this is so important for us in these kinds of environments. So researchers differentiate what we call appraisal stress. Do you ever have those friends that walk around and they always seem stressed out and like, you know, the smallest little thing sends them off and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. I got a text from my boss. And you're like, well, he texts me all the time. So, you know, there's some sense of the appraisal of that experience that gets to be really stressful for some people. But then you can also talk about objective things, like it might be the death of a spouse or some kind of financial hardship that most likely would impact anybody in that kind of situation. But it's hard to be able to predict that kind of difference. Who's going to respond? What are those thresholds about what's going to be objective and kind of set somebody off or more of an appraisal based? But we know from a lot of research that stress and our perceptions of stress and how we respond to stress can lead to distress. So here's a model where we see that stressor, let's say exposure to violence within the home or the community, influences how you appraise other kind of experiences. In fact, when kids are exposed to a lot of violence, they tend to put on these kind of glasses where they see violence in the community. We call it a hostile attribution bias, very technical term, but often people infer greater levels of aggression in other people's actions when they've had a lot of exposure to violence. That also shows up in bullying. When a kid gets bullied a whole lot, they put on those glasses of like, I gotta protect myself. I want to be able to kind of down-regulate a little bit so I don't actually have to respond to this. And prior experiences, as well as your ability to cope, hopefully you're seeing some of our Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention focal areas showing up in this model. We work with a model called Coping Power, which addresses coping, surprise, surprise, and it really is trying to change those hostile attribution biases for aggressive kids because they have that hair trigger, you know, that kind of sends them off. Somebody bumps into them in the hallway and they have that really enhanced response. So we really want to try to break down this process, and this is why we need to be thinking school-wide about these activities, but also need to be thinking across the tiers how we provide that additional support for kids that need it. And we know from decades of research that stress causes a range of behavioral, mental health, and physical health outcomes. We could talk about psychological stress and psychiatric disorders that can result. We can talk about lower productivity, and then we're talking about kids, parents, and families, and teachers as well. But also even poorer physical health that can actually have a significant impact on your body and your brain. And this is a snapshot of one of my two homes, Baltimore. Hopefully when you hear of Baltimore, you think about this lovely scene. But in fact, the kids we work with don't spend a lot of time in the Inner Harbor. This is home to them. There's issues of abandoned housing, all kinds of concerns. These often become areas of drug dens. You see a lot of boarded up buildings, a lot of kids walking through. This one with the school bus is always disheartening to me because you've got kids thinking this is home sweet home for them, often living in very, very difficult areas. This is even one of the slides from my colleague Phil Leaf, who's very connected to the work in Baltimore City, When Thugs Cry. So it's not just us from the outside that are perceiving these issues, but people within that community are very concerned about the levels of violence And obviously we were very impacted by the events following the untimely death of Freddie Gray and the tensions that had led and the results of riots and other kinds of challenges in Baltimore. And you see often driving through Baltimore creches that are set up, and so these are actually commemorations to individuals that have died, and it's a lot of alcohol bottles in many cases, but often is a way to recognize. But this just isn't happening in Baltimore. Sadly, my other home, Charlottesville, again, if you haven't been watching the news, you may not be aware that we had a huge protest of white supremacists and Nazis show up on our campus and in our town with literally torches. They were protesting our removal of a number of Confederate statues, and this has been a very challenging issue for many of us and our entire community, and we're certainly not through it, and there's a lot of work yet to be done. And for many people, this was awareness raising because the issues of white supremacy and contemporary Nazi activity were just not quite as present and omnipresent for all of us. So let's talk about stress. So how do these kinds of experiences impact the way that teachers interact with students and the way that students are interacting with each other when they come into the classroom? That hypersensitivity, that threshold, it's hard to be able to tell what kind of experiences are going to be perceived as stressful for some. Some kids are very easily ignited because their exposure to violence or other kind of even biological factors that may make them more physically responsive to different kinds of stressors. And we know that kids that are getting repeat hits to that stress system, the cortisol system, that brain behavior and connectivity around hormones, that really can lead to a lot of dysregulation of their emotions and their behavior. In fact, we know that stress can get under the skin very easily. There's a large body of genetic research about different circuitry within the brain and brain development that show very significant impacts of stress, and not just during early childhood. Those stressors certainly have a very significant impact at developmentally sensitive time periods like early childhood, but they can have an impact across the life course. We have this fancy term called allostatic load that talks about, sometimes when you get stressed out, you don't always bounce back to that starting point. That stress kind of does more wear and tear on your system, so you're not really able to respond as well. And that happens not just psychologically, but physically. We actually have biological data to show that individuals, including kids, have different physiological kind of responses to subsequent stressors. And this is one reason why interactions between gene and environmental experiences are so important for us to think about. So as we think about the research around stress, it helps us remember that there might be some biological and experiential reasons why some kids see certain behaviors and interpret it a little bit differently, and that certainly can impact the way they make decisions. If they're in this kind of mode, if they see everybody as wearing, literally there's one paper I cite called remember all those point and shoot video games, and there was one called Mortal Kombat? And this study actually had college kids go play this point and shoot video game, Mortal Kombat, which I don't even know that they make anymore. But they actually showed in these laboratory studies that after repeated exposure to this, that these college kids were developing a hostile attribution bias and making decisions in their own real world situations as rated by peers and other people. They were kind of carrying those lens, and the title of the paper was Seeing the World Through Mortal Kombat Lens Glasses. And so I always think of that example. Obviously that was an experimental study using video games because you can't actually manipulate that in real life. But there are actually causal studies to show that some of those experiences can change the way we perceive the world. So it's not surprising why some of our kids need additional supports, particularly within that Tier 2 and Tier 3 level. But we need to be focused on providing that Tier 1 support foundation for everybody so that way we can enhance the environment for our more vulnerable youth. And sadly, sometimes we put in place certain kind of strategies that aren't really consistent with these kinds of concerns. We can think about suspension and punishment as being actually strategies that may even send off kids quite a bit. There's even some research to suggest that kids downregulate as a result of a lot of exposure to violence, and that they don't really care that much about being suspended. And we know from the behavioral research that also can be reinforcing for them because it gets them out of going to school. But we need to be very careful about sometimes our strategies where we're intending to do the right thing may not actually map onto what we know about the science and the research. And this is where schools come in. Schools can act as a buffer to really help absorb some of these challenges and make sure we are really promoting that Maslow hierarchy of needs and providing that base of support and safety. So that way we can support all of our students and our staff. We see some reference to this in trauma-informed approaches as well as some of the advanced tiers work. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about what can be done to improve climate. We've talked about why it's important, how to measure it, how to conceptualize it, what's some of the research about why it's so important for us from a biological and psychological perspective. So hopefully you're all aware this conference is about positive behavior support and implementing it. So I'm not going to really go into the details about it, but I want you to make sure that you're connecting up with the core elements of this model, really understanding that it's about data, systems, and practices. And when I talk about it from a school climate lens, just think about it like your operating system on a computer. So many of you probably use Windows on your computer. And doesn't that give you a guide about how to actually pull open a new program? So let's say if I want to do some kind of math problem or something, I might pull up Excel. But I don't have to learn a whole new language about Excel. I kind of know how to pull open the program because I'm using Windows. And even if I went to China, and I don't know how to read any kind of Chinese characters, but if I found a computer, even if it had other language, I'd have a general framework for how it worked because I'm used to that operating system. So think about PBIS as being your operating system for your school. If you want to address bullying, if you want to address climate, if you want to do restorative practices, think about it as your operating system where you're just pulling open that other program to help you meet that kind of goal. Or you're collecting data within that framework to actually make decisions around it. So I'd encourage you to think about it not as a program, but really as a framework or an operating system for your school. And think about the kind of supports that are needed around coaching. I've been talking about environment, safety, and engagement, and those are really very foundational to the PBIS model. Very important for us to think about. These are some examples of some of the postings within the schools that we work in Baltimore City. I think this one on the bottom right is kind of interesting about life skills. My whole shtick is really about integrating things, kind of connecting the dots. I have this colleague, Roger Weisberg, who's here in Chicago, and he talks about the difference between splitters and lumpers. Splitters see a lot of differences between things, and they're really good about setting columns and saying these two things are different. And then they're lumpers. I'm clearly a lumper. I just throw everything together and see so many connections, sometimes to a fault. I might gloss over some of the detailed differences, but I see a lot of connections between what we're doing in different fields around social emotional learning, around life skills, and positive behavior support that really can fold into this operating system of PBIS to be able to meet your broader goals and invoke different models and different frameworks along the way. So you think about your 3 to 5 behavioral expectations. A lot of schools have things like being safe, being ready, and being respectful. Well, don't those really map onto safety, engagement, environment? So again, connecting up what you're doing around positive behavior support to school climate. And here, I think I have a tattoo of this on my ankle, so I literally had this slide when I went to the University of Virginia and gave my job talk there and talked about what kind of data are we collecting around our faculty productivity on grants? What kind of systems for mentorship do we have in place? And what kind of practices, like professional development, are we putting together for our faculty? So you can think about these kinds of models in any kind of organizational system. And I think that's what's so beautiful about the simplicity, but yet the complexity of this kind of framework. So I'd encourage you to think about when you're trying to integrate different data around school climate, it's not something off to the side. It's really part of that core model. And when you want to do another program like restorative practices, in my mind, that fits very squarely in the practice framework. So very easy to think about connectivity. And let's talk a little bit about the tiers. When I talk to my mom about what I do, I talk to her about it in ice cream. Tier 1 is vanilla. Tier 2, a little bit of chocolate sauce on there, need a little something special. Tier 3, highly specialized and tailored. She gets that. She doesn't get this. But we public health PhDs really like this kind of framework. It helps us feel very fancy. But quite often, we're ultimately talking about who's going to get the cherry, and we don't have enough cherries to hand around. So we need to be very careful about who's going to get those cherries, because everybody looks like they need a cherry walking in, but we need to be very careful about that. And we know that the intensity of support, cherries are more expensive than some of the other toppings, so we need to really reserve those kinds of resources for the kids that need them. And we need to be very careful about not handing out things to everybody that walks in because they look like they need something. So this is one of the PBIS slides that I like a lot because it talks about the continuum of supports, the kind of data, the resources, and the environment that are going to need to be able to meet those more intensive kids. And here I go with that kind of integration. My colleague at the Maryland State Department of Education, Andrea Alexander, who's now with SAMHSA, put together this. She's kind of a little bit hippie and into tie-dyes and stuff. And she was like, Katherine, don't all these things really just fit together? And so this is a model that we use quite a lot to talk about organizing different kinds of programs and strategies. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about social-emotional learning because I think that's one of those approaches that could actually be helpful to think about integrating within the model. And in fact, when social-emotional learning kind of first came out, they were doing a lot of inventorying of different programs. But it's very interesting now to see the migration around social-emotional learning to actually look a lot more like an integrated model, thinking more about how we actually scale up different interventions and think about curriculum, school-wide practices, and other kinds of supports that are going to happen. So our team's been doing quite a bit of thinking about how we integrate social-emotional learning with activities around positive behavior support. And perhaps I'm the only person to ever be a board member of APBS and of CASEL in their life. That might be. So I'm excited about that. And in fact, there's a lot to be excited about in social-emotional learning. There are a series of meta-analyses that have come out to show that these particular practices, especially when implemented within the context of a school-wide type of effort and with high fidelity, actually improve outcomes for students. And those include not only social-emotional skills, but they translate into academic outcomes. This was a study that came out in 2011 of 213 different social-emotional programs. We thought this was a pretty cool study at the time. It is so cool. But these are the near-term effects. They just came out in August with a follow-up study where they looked at long-term impacts, actually well into high school, and finds that many of those effects are actually sustained and sometimes grow. And again, I have my little asterisks here to highlight that interestingly, there weren't any differences by socioeconomic status or setting. And while sometimes we researchers like to find differences, this is kind of one of those areas where it's nice to see that those effects are consistent across setting and across subgroups. I'd like to see us be able to close that gap rather than maintain it, but it's good to make sure that we aren't actually growing that gap through many of these programs. And let's close out by talking a little bit about what we're learning from our research on PBIS more specifically. The field of social-emotional learning has kind of been around for a little bit longer in terms of some of the package programs and the efforts, and there are many more people developing social-emotional learning programs than there are people developing models of positive behavior support. And so that's one reason why it's so important for us to continue to do the research around positive behavior support and understand how it has an impact in many settings. Some of our early work focused on elementary schools, and we found the impacts on school climate as staff reported it. The idea that you can implement PBIS just at Tier 1 and actually improve how people perceive their principal leadership, I mean, if we didn't find anything else, I'd be really pretty happy with that. Because if anybody else knows how to improve principal leadership through just doing Tier 1 kind of supports, let me know. Because that's one of those really hard kind of needles to move. And so the idea that within 2 or 3 years, you're actually changing a leadership style in a way that can be detected by the school staff that are working there, that's very impressive. Not to mention the collegial relationships, the focus on academics, and the other dimensions of school climate that we also care about. But what was also interesting in this study, and these are elementary schools, we found that the schools that started off with less favorable climate, it took them a little bit longer to implement PBIS, but they actually implemented it and improved the most in their climate. So while this might suggest to you, oh gosh, it's really going to take 3 to 5 years, and yes, we have data to support the 3 to 5 year trajectory, but It's actually going to be a big investment to get those schools on board, but most likely one that's going to yield a lot of gains for you. So important for us to think about, don't just try something and let it go after a year, especially in those little bit more challenged contexts. You've got to really make that 3 to 5 year commitment in order to see those impacts. And I like this kind of rule of thirds that we ended up with. It wasn't a hypothesis, it just came out in the data that we cut office referrals by a third, we cut suspensions by a third, and we also improved academic performance by about a third. So that's pretty impressive with just Tier 1 supports. So these are findings that we've all published. They've been out for a couple of years. But then we started to dig into this a little bit more. Can teachers actually see these behaviors in the classroom? And so we had teachers fill out checklists. Yes, lots of checklists on all their students. And we found significant impacts on all of these outcomes that were changing in these classrooms, especially the earlier kids got exposed to PBIS, coming into kindergarten. And this is just the way the school works. Kind of like that operating system. You know, I just did a big update on my computer, and now I'm trying to figure out how to use all these things again because things have moved around just a little bit. But if I had started with this computer and had that new system already in place, I would just think that's how this computer worked. And that's a kindergartner coming into a PBIS school. That's just the way my school is, and not some switch we try to flip overnight. But the idea that we can actually improve emotion regulation and cut down on inappropriate service referrals and things like that, those are really important indicators for us to be able to see. And we saw the higher risk students are actually the ones that benefited the most. We did a disaggregation into kind of green, yellow, red. We got 4 groups rather than 3. The green kids can't really get any greener. I know we're not supposed to label kids, but we kind of came up with our fancy way of doing it with statistics to actually try to approximate who are the kids that are doing really well in the school environment. Some of those kids, based on our measures, couldn't actually get any better because we have this kind of floor effect that's going on there. But it was really those 2 higher risk kids groups, a little bit smaller. They approximate those Tier 2 and Tier 3. Those are the ones that benefited the most just from Tier 1 supports. So in my mind, that's pretty compelling evidence that you got to get that Tier 1 in place, and that it helps you figure out who's going to get the cherries. Remember the cherries. So these are some other findings that we have generated based on high schools. Let's shift gears a little bit out of elementary schools into high schools. And we found significant impacts on kids' reports of weapon carrying, skipping school, marijuana use, as well as engagement within the community through PBIS implementation. When we think a little bit about Tier 2 findings, in this case we randomly assigned schools that were already trained in PBIS to get additional supports in Tier 2. And we focused largely on a student support teaming model and functional behavioral assessment. We even found that the teachers, even with those kinds of tools, reported better efficacy to manage behavior problems, more students receiving services in the classroom rather than outside of the referrals. Also found that we were cutting down on the number of inappropriate referrals to special education. And when I talk about that to the economists, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. And not that this is just about saving money, but we are actually doing a cost analysis now to try to figure out how do these kinds of impacts actually translate into cost savings, not just for that school, but for a school district or even a broader community. And we did find impacts on academic performance as well. And more recently, we have been digging into our data as it relates to disproportionality. And much like the SEL findings, we didn't find any differences in terms of reductions of office referrals based on the Tier 1. So we needed to dig a little bit deeper and be thinking more explicitly about what we're doing in training around disproportionality. So our team has been working with a model called Double Check, and there are 5 different elements of our conceptual framework around cultural proficiency training. And we found that when we combined positive behavior support with a mere 5 hours of professional development, and classroom coaching of teachers around classroom management and student engagement, particularly with students of color. And these are findings that are just now under review. We found significant impacts on office referrals for African American students. So actually moving the needle on office referrals for African American students specifically is very exciting for us, and also a little nerve-wracking to make sure those findings generalize to other settings. But interestingly, through the professional development, we found that the teachers' own ratings of efficacy were changing, but we didn't see an impact on their ratings of efficacy changing just from the coaching. In order to actually see the behavioral outcomes for the teacher, like their classroom management and office referrals, they needed to have coaching. It wasn't just the professional development. So be thinking quite a bit more about what kind of supports you need in that area. We've also done a quasi-experimental study, which is a very fancy term for, we're trying to figure out if PBIS has actually had an impact in Maryland, because they've been doing this model since the very beginning, and now we've got a critical mass of schools. In fact, over half of the schools in the state have been trained in Tier 1 supports. So we got a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to work with very fancy statistical approaches, including propensity score matching. So what that means is, although we can't randomize all the schools in the state to figure out what impact PBIS is having, we took schools that were kind of similar to each other on a whole list of demographic characteristics and then weighted them so that way we could have essentially the PBIS group and the comparison group. And lo and behold, across multiple indicators, and this is 2006 to 2012 data, we found significant impacts across elementary, middle, and high on suspensions, office referrals, truancy, as well as improvements in math and reading. That's pretty exciting. And this isn't a trial. This isn't anything that we hired coaches to go in. This is a natural scale-up that's happening in the state. Very, very exciting. And I'll just wrap up with one kind of anecdote. We put out a study earlier this year and came out in May about looking at school climate data over a decade in one of our school districts in the state of Maryland that has a critical number of PBIS schools. And so this is kind of one of those, it's hard to sell good news, because we actually found out of 13 indicators related to bullying and school climate, 10 of them were improving significantly. I will give you the caveat that the study ran from 2004 to 2014, and so we've had a lot going on since 2014. And we are going to be analyzing to see if there's some more recent events related to the election and other kinds of tensions that are happening. But significant impacts that are happening in a critical mass of PBIS schools using data around school climate to be able to improve that. We even got written up in the New York Times just recently for this work, and so it's really very exciting to have a good news story, but I can't tell you how many emails I get about, really? I don't know if I believe that. So there is a glimmer of hope out there, and not just for bullying, but also on school climate. I think the concentration of schools that have come on board with models like positive behavior support and are more attentive to issues of school climate are actually having an impact. And that's very exciting to see in a foundation that we want to build on. We have a lot of work to do. We need to be thinking a lot more about implementation and supports, but it's very exciting to see some impacts through 20 years of work that the TA Center and the leaders in this field have taught us how to do and empowered us to try to implement and affect that change in our school. So I would encourage you to tell the good news that's happening in your area. And this is very important for us as a field. So I have a long list of lessons learned, and I hope you've kind of heard some of these themes out of my talk today. I'm an advocate of the Tier 1. Sadly, when we go into some other schools that don't have a Tier 1 support with our advanced tier, we find that it's very hard to get the traction and the buy-in and the consistency. So I'm pretty sold on the model about starting with Tier 1. I know there are differences of opinion around that, but I think it's very foundational, and I think it goes back to some of that Maslow type of stuff and around school climate. Identifying climate and behavior as important goals, using data, communicating the good news that's happening. In fact, I can get up here with p-values and statistics, but you're N of one, the principal that you know that implemented PBIS and had a positive change, or the group that really adopted something, those stories. And I want to empower you to tell those good news stories, because we need to do a better job marketing and sharing the information, not in a misleading way, but in a truth-telling, in a testimonial way. I can't believe me as a researcher saying I want to talk about testimonies, but that's really what it takes to change behavior, is to see somebody like me or like my school that has implemented this and had that change. Oh, and by the way, we have a lot of rigorous research to show this is probably going to work for you too. But we need to put out that good news, and we need it to be data-driven, and we need to be communicating. And that integration, again, remember your lumpers and your splitters? Hopefully you're starting to think a little bit about what can you lump together, not in a disrespectful way, but what can you connect up? That integration is really very critical. How are we empowering youth to be part of this change? How are we giving them voice and promoting positive youth development strategies? And PBIS isn't just about changing adult behavior, but it's empowering youth to make the right decisions and reinforcing those good decisions. I spent a lot of time thinking about implementation and coaching and fidelity, and so I'd also really want to highlight how critical that is, because we can get lost in some of the good news and the numbers and the wow numbers, as I call them, about how many schools are doing things, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure we're really implementing with fidelity. And thinking about coaching, that can certainly be an effective tool for promoting high-quality implementation. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a leadership team in your building or in your district on board, you're probably not able to really do much. So I would encourage all of you, especially those of you that have voice within your schools and within your communities, to serve as that leadership role and get more schools on board to understand the importance of data and systems and practices and how they can be integrated together. I'm here today, but I represent a very large and deep bench of expertise at 2 universities, the State Department of Education, a great health partner at Shepherd Pratt, and many school districts. Some of my folks in the district actually have changed over time, as they have at the state, but these were some folks that were very critical in helping us get launched, as has many federal agencies in terms of supporting our work. So with that, I am going to conclude, and we have a little bit of time for action planning in your teams, and so Lucille is going to come up and give us very detailed instructions about what elevator and escalator to use to get to our area.
You see why our PBIS Center and all of our work so respects, needs, and loves Katherine Bradshaw. Thank you for that, making it real and practical, even though it's based on brilliance and science. You can make it real for all of us. Thank you, Katherine. Her PowerPoint is already posted on the app and at pbis.org if you're interested in reviewing some of the slides. We have fantastic presenters. Thank you to all of you who are presenting, because we have 95% of the materials already posted. If you're, we're going to pull a wall over here. You can take your team time right here in this room. You can go down to level D, or you can go to your chosen breakout room for your next session to have some dialogue with your team members. So have a fantastic day, and we'll see you at the poster session back in this room tonight. Thank you.